Thank you for being here. My name is Feng Wu. I'm an author and co-founder of Society of Heart's Delight. So we are a San Jose-based organization established in 2020. So actually just right at the start of the pandemic. So we're quite young. So we have done a lot of events amazingly. And it's just wonderful. We can continue with a lot of Zoom events and also some in-person events now. So majority of members are immigrants from China who are professionals and also bilingual. So it's kind of very unique about our organization. And we promote interracial and intercultural dialogues. We will also want to have fun. We want to build a community. We want us to be together. So to build a home together. So please check out us, check us out on our WeChat, Instagram, and other social media. And welcome to tonight's event, Rediscovering the history and the voice of Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans. So in Chinese, the translation is 重新认识华人移民和华裔美国人的历史. So this event is part of a celebration of AAPI Heritage Month. And we are grateful for the support of Santa Clara County's mini grant. And I'm also very, very delighted tonight to have Connie Young Yu join us. I've been a big admirer of her for a long time. So, and I'm just really, really glad she's here with us tonight. And she's been extremely busy, but she basically took the time to be with us. So hello, Connie. So nice to see you.
Pleasure to be here, Fan.
Connie is a well-known historian and writer. She's the author of Chinatown San Jose, USA, and co-editor of Voices from the Railroad, stories from Descendants of Railroad Workers. She has drawn from the experience of her pioneer ancestors and conducted oral histories for Stanford's Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project. She was a member of the committee that stopped the demolition of the detention barracks on Angel Island. For over 50 years, she has worked to bring forth hidden stories of Asian Americans and combating anti-Asian hate. Connie was featured in the PBS documentary, Asian Americans. If you have not watched the documentary, I highly, highly recommend it. So it's just fantastic. Tonight, our event is just about an hour. So I wish it was much longer, but Connie's very busy. And the last 15 minutes in the Q&A session, so if you have questions for Connie, so the last 15 minutes, that's your time. Please send your question to me through the Q&A box on the screen. Okay, so let's start. I'm just really excited about this conversation with Connie.
Thank you.
So Connie, I have read your books. I have also read many of your articles. I also have watched the documentary I just mentioned, Asian Americans, actually twice. And I made my whole family watch the documentary with me. So you have done so much for the Chinese and Asian American communities. I just wanted to say thank you to you on behalf of Society of Heart's Delight. You have done a lot for the community. So you are a descendant of a pioneering Chinese American family. In your book about the early Chinatowns in San Jose, you paint a vivid picture of Chinatown's history and the people living there. Amazing stories, very, very personal stories too. So what kind of life was like for the Chinese back then? Was there anything in your own life experience that inspired you to actually write the book?
Well, I'm very fortunate in that my parents saved documents of the paper trail. All Chinese immigrants had paper trail. They're the most documented race in America because of the Chinese exclusion law. So I will begin with the paper that my mother showed me when I was starting to write one of my first articles. This is a document, it's called the Chok Ji, and it's a certificate of residence that all Chinese had to carry. They all had to carry because of a law of 1892 called the Geary Act, and that required all Chinese men, women, and children to carry a certificate with their photograph. And at that time, the Chinese 6 companies ordered everyone, we're going to resist this. This is unconstitutional. They asked everybody to pay $1 fee. That's that's a day's wages. My grandfather at the time was a worker. A day's wages meant a lot, but it was part of the resistance. This is to pay for the legal fees to fight the Geary Act. And this means so much to me. It shows the Chinese resisted, they resisted this, the unfair treatment, the injustice and the exclusion, and that my grandfather was part of it. So in writing one of my first articles for a magazine called Concerned Asian Scholars, the first Asian American issue, my mother said, here's your grandfather's chokji, and she had kept it for over 100 years. And here it is. We used it for the cover of this. And you could see it. There's his face, which I think is so wonderful and warm. And I knew him so well as an elderly person. But I treasure, I have the original one. I treasure it. It's in my safekeeping. It just symbolized so much. It is evidence. And it says, it has his name and a stamped laborer. And the year was, it was May. It's always May. It was issued May 3rd, 1894. So that shows the Chinese lost their case. They had to register. So this is an example of the documents that my mother saved. And she saved the birth certificate of her father. That's on the maternal side. Her father, Li Yuxui, he was born in the United States, the son of a railroad worker, born in San Francisco. His birth certificate was so precious to him that during the earthquake, and he was a young man with a wife and a baby, and his father, the railroad worker, they were escaping the fire and the earthquake in 1906, San Francisco. My grandfather runs back, leaves his family, says to his father, take them to the ferry, get going, I have to go back. He goes back to his store to save the birth certificate, which I have. And he puts it in his minop. He had a big heavy jacket, and a soldier, thinking he was a looter, came by and just bayoneted him. And he was stabbed on the side and he fell over, and he just pretended he was dead. And he covered his wound, and it was just a flesh wound. And when the soldier went away, he hobbled to safety. Now this story, I did not tell publicly till the 100th anniversary of the earthquake. I was in an auditorium in Chinatown, and we had a panel discussion. And it was after Katrina, in New Orleans, the huge disaster in which looters were also, arrested. And there was a Black woman sitting next to me. She's telling the story of what happened to her family in New Orleans. And I'm sitting next to her, and I said, well, here's what happened to my grandfather. And I tell the whole story of escaping. And then when I mentioned, and then he was bayoneted, there was a huge gasp in the audience. And I was so shocked because I've lived with the story all my life. My cousins and I, we used to pretend that we'd play dead, in case a soldier would come and bayonet us because we were saving our birth certificates, So
when you grew up, you heard a lot of stories about the old Chinatowns.
Yeah. So, but those are the dramatic ones. And my mother told me about Chinatown. My grandmother told me about Chinatown, San Francisco. And my father told me about Chinatown, San Jose. So that's the second one that was built after the burning of the first one. So everything that I've been involved with this month, and I have to tell you, this month I have to give a talk on the apology, apologies to Chinese communities. This is for an Ascent leadership, corporate leadership program. And they want to talk about why apologies are important. And I talked about the the San Jose apology for injustices toward Chinese in the 19th century. And you saw there was a big coverage, CNN, even BBC, and it was so gratifying that we had this story that was hidden for so long about the burning of Chinatown, which my grandfather was in, and he escaped. And I had the personal story of what Chinatown meant to him. It was in 1887, when it was burned to the ground. Before that, it was one of the largest Chinatowns in California, and people do not realize that there were any Chinatowns in San Jose.
Yeah,
So-
true. I mean, I was really glad I was a witness. I was witness of the apology event, and because the event. I mean, before I read a lot of books about Asian American histories, but because that apology event, I actually started to read more, and I was talking to a lot of friends about Chinatowns too, the older Chinatowns in San Jose. A lot of them, like, really? There was a Chinatown in San Jose. So I think there's a lot of, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but to me, it's just fascinating stories, in the older Chinatown. And so in your writing, there was something very interesting. You kind of described these old Chinatowns, I'm talking about, San Jose Chinatowns, as a multicultural place. So, a lot of immigrants, especially when they have cultural and language barriers, they keep to themselves. So when you mentioned, the older Chinatowns being kind of multicultural, so that really, kind of made me wonder what kind of life, what's like for people there.
Well,
I
really have to clarify. The Chinatown, when it was burned to the ground by arson, within 10 days, the Chinese merchants met with a man named John Heinlein, who's a German-American immigrant, who they were friends. This business partners, and he leased land to the Chinese in a very nice area, which is now Japantown. So when I talk about a multicultural community, it's the Chinatown, it's the Japantown that grew out of Chinatown because of John Heinlein. The Chinatown itself, Heinleinville, because there's no other people of color at that time. It was all Chinese. And to protect the Chinese, John Heinlein erected an 8-foot-high fence. It was 5.5 acres surrounded by an 8-foot-high fence. And it was all Chinese, like a Cantonese village. And it was run by the merchants that were formerly in the burned out Chinatown. And it was home base to all the workers in the valley, which is now called the Valley of the Heart's Delight, but Chinese labor developed it. So it wasn't multicultural. I really have to make this very clear because, but what made it the community that it is today, which is truly multicultural, truly diverse, and it stands for something, is because John Heinlein, when the Japanese came, he leased land to the Japanese as well. When the Japanese came, they had no place to go but Chinatown, and the Chinese gave them credit. It was just, that was one of the great, to me, one of the great stories of support of people and friendship, and the fact that it was, to me, the beginning of an Asian American community when that happened. But they did not live within the Chinatown. John Heinlein established an area where they could have their own Chinatown because the cultures are so different, and we respect the cultures that are different, and that's why we celebrate them. Because there was Japantown, a Filipino community came in and lived there, and they lived within this area, and they established something called Pinoy Town. So I always say this was the beginning of the Asian American community in San Jose, in the Valley. I mean, I don't think there's anything like it.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. It's a lot of collaborations, integrations already.
I'm very proud that it started with the Chinese they've refused to be driven out of San Jose. They refused. The burning of the Chinatown was to drive them out. They refused. They said, our work is here, our people are here, our home base should be here. So that's what I feel that is part of the history, but we have to talk about the evolution, how this developed, how Japantown developed and what it stands for today.
I remember you mentioned in your writing, your grandfather had a store, right?
Yes.
A store in Chinatown. And
Right.
your mother actually was also a businesswoman, and she really advocated for like Chinese culture. So
Yes.
could you tell us a little bit about that?
So my grandfather, you see in the certificate of origin, a certificate of residence, he was a laborer, and he had gone, because he came, this is very, I think I have to describe the intricacies of the laws and the loophole. My grandfather came in 1881 as a 11-year-old laborer. And in our family, it goes, oh, you're so lucky grandpa came when he was 11, before the exclusion law, or else you wouldn't be here. So I always knew that year, the night, but because he had a passport that said he came, papers that said he came before the exclusion law, he was allowed to go back to China to get married. When he came to the United States, his mother told him, please come back in 10 years and get married, and when he was, after the burning of Chinatown, he fled to San Francisco. He found word that his father was very, very ill. And he was saying, I've got to go back to China to fulfill my, Guangzhou, he was in Heilongsan, southern China. And I have to go back to the village and see my father. And he received word his father died, and he was very, very distraught, but he went back to see his mother. She arranged a marriage for him. And, that was my grandmother. And he stayed there as long as he could. He said, well, maybe I'll have a family, but she did not get pregnant. And he was anxious to go back to San Jose to make a living, because the villages were really impoverished. That's why people came to the United States. There was no hope of opportunity in the village. So anyway, he could not bring his wife because he had re-entry papers, but could not, as a laborer, could not bring his wife. So he realized the only thing he could do was to work very, very hard, go back to San Jose, Chinatown, become a merchant. You see, this is very, very important. Some laborers were able to do that. That's why we were able to have families and able to have another generation. Not very many, but so he became a partner in the store in Highlandville, Chinatown. And it took him so many years. It took him 14 years. They were separated for 14 years before he could send for his wife. That's one of the big stories. And they said, oh, she was in her, I guess, 30. They said, oh, that you're just too old. You're not going to have any children. Why go to be reunited? And of course, my grandfather said, I want my wife to be here. And he sent for her, and she was able to come, but she was so terrified of being deported. She said, but anyways, they were reunited. A year later, she had a baby, my uncle, and a year after that, another son, my father. And here's their family, picture of their family. Can you see?
Yes.
This was taken, and I guess this would be 1913 in San Jose, Chinatown. That's my uncle Ming, George, and my father, Su Jun. So that's how they got a start. And my father had a wonderful childhood. He said he loved living in this Chinese village. He had to go to Chinese school, but he could also go to American school. And at that time, that people do not realize, the Chinatowns at the turn of the century were very politicized. My grandfather was a revolutionary. He was a supporter of Sun Yat-sen, like a lot of the workers in America, and donated funds, sacrificed. And when the revolution succeeded, the Chinese, in 1911, the Chinese had status, a little more status, they still were not able to be naturalized, but China was a republic, and that changed somewhat America's viewpoint of the Chinese. but overall, it was still an exclusion era. So.
Yeah. So definitely, even just within your family, so it was a lot of injustice and very sad stories.
I think every single Chinese who lived during this era endured racism, institutionalized racism, because they couldn't get jobs in certain areas. You know, there was no civil rights in those days. The Chinese, you know, their parents couldn't be naturalized, therefore they couldn't vote. And so, yes, but they struggled. For example, when my father was in World War II, he was a decorated officer with the US Army, you know, comes back to America, you know, and lives in San Francisco, Chinatown, with his wife and 3 children, and said, you know, we're going to move out of Chinatown. It was the smallest little apartment. We were right next to a sweatshop, you know, I can hear the machines at night. And then, so he goes to the Richmond district, a residential area, and tries to buy a house. Chinese were denied. They couldn't buy a house. He had to get his army buddy, a German American of the same rank of major, to buy the house and then sell it to him. That's how we got into an all-white neighborhood. That's a typical example of institutionalized racism, you know, that he was trained as an engineer at Stanford, couldn't get a job. A lot of, in those days, can you believe it? Companies did not hire Chinese as engineers. He was given like a 1-year, you know, no temporary, no permanent position. So back to Chinatown, he becomes a businessman, a soy sauce manufacturer, and invested in restaurants and became very successful, and a community leader. And he felt that, and this is where I get my activism and the fact that you have to make things happen. And my mother also was involved with promoting Chinese culture and you know, civil rights. But it was very hard in the 50s, and it was during the Cold War. People have to realize that during the Cold War, you know, just a few years earlier, the Chinese and Americans were allies. The Chinese exclusion law was repealed in 1943. Chinese could be naturalized. Then suddenly the Red China, you know, gets into the Korean War. My father's called to active duty, he's promoted to lieutenant colonel. Suddenly the Chinese are the enemy, you know, perceived as the enemy. So he just said, we have to stress patriotism and that we paid in blood. So he spearheaded a movement to have a war memorial for Chinese who made the ultimate sacrifice in World War I and World War II. And that monument was dedicated on Memorial Day in 1951, how many years ago? And it's at St. Mary's Square. You could see it now. And but that's the kind of activism you had to have in those days to prove that you're American, just to be recognized as equal. And at the same time, there's this FBI flyer that's distributed in all Chinese communities. And it's asking people to report suspicious activities, you know, that might be deemed as communism. So you can imagine what the communities felt like. And I grew up in that era, I gave, you know, I was, all the kids, you know, we'd enter a speech contest with the Chinese Citizens Alliance, CACA, to speak about what democracy means to me. I remember I came in second place in one of the contests.
I mean, did you and your siblings, I understand you have 2 siblings, yes, and you experience any type of racism or something kind of really kind of stayed with you when you were, you know, young?
Well, I was growing up in Whittier, being the only Chinese family during World War II, and my mother having the Chinese gift shop, you know, we were considered very special, and also US-China were allies. And we did not experience racism. There were things that my mother and father did not tell me, like how hard it was to rent the house. And, people would just say, we don't rent to Chinese, but later, we lived in Whittier, had a great time, and then moved to San Francisco. And that's when I experienced racism, because I realized I was in a segregated Chinatown and that we could not move out. That's when, it would not be so personal, like people pushing me, but I could feel it, and when I moved into the white neighborhood, I could just feel in the very beginning, the neighbors would look at us, but we won them over, and then in the classroom, I felt that our teachers were very, well, they treated us all equally. They taught very well. The situation that I realized was that, my parents told me stories of, being from pioneer families, that we had pride. In all my textbooks, there was no mention of the Chinese in California, no mention of the Chinese building the railroad, no mention of Chinese in the gold rush. And we had made a map, a California map of paper mache, and we'd have popsicle sticks for the 21 missions of Father Sarah. And that would be completely, you could never do something like that now. Father Sarah, who decimated the Native American population, and religious, and no mention of the Chinese, and no mention of the injustices, that the Chinese were not allowed to testify in court in 1854 against a white person. So, racism, I think my parents protected us because of where we lived. They didn't tell us that my neighbor, Mrs. Potter, whom I loved, was the one who passed around a petition against us before we moved in. I did not learn that till my wedding day, when Mrs. Potter came with a gift, and my mother told me later, she goes, that petition, it was Mrs. Potter who's there.
Wow, so your family you can trace to the older Chinatowns in San Jose, and also the, San Francisco's Chinatown area too, and also the Richmond area. Very, it's just a really rich history, family history. So 3 years ago, you actually gave the opening commencement speech at the Golden Spike ceremony. I think it's at a promontory point in Utah. And it was there 150 years ago. The two railroads were joined together to form the first transcontinental railroad. Of course, that's very important in history, in the United States. A lot of people know about that. But again, a lot of people do not know about how Chinese workers played, what kind of things they did, building the railroad. Your great-grandfather helped build the railroad. So when you were giving the speech at the ceremony, you wore your mother's blue dress. It's a very beautiful dress. I understand that there was a story there. So tell us why this particular dress.
Yes. I have to tell you, it was a great moment for me. It was really, I guess I felt that was the pinnacle of my work all these years, but also of my parents' work, because I have to tell you that my parents my father helped found the Chinese Historical Society of America. Mm-hmm. He was on the first board. And this was in 1963. And the goal of the society at that time was to talk about pioneer history, to show how Chinese were early builders of America in the infrastructure. They contributed and what they went through, but they were pioneers. And so Philip Choi, the president of the Chinese Historical Society, he said, this is our chance to put the Chinese on the map. People do not know that the Chinese, we're talking about the 1960s. And he said, this was the moment, because the Chinese knew. The Chinese themselves knew. The Chinatowns, we'd always have images. I knew, but it was never in textbooks. So the centennial, you cannot imagine, was such a big deal, especially in California. You'd pick up a magazine like from PG&E, you know, they'd have a picture, but they'd have a picture of promontory of the meeting of the rails. And that's a picture that has no Chinese in it. And no mention of the Chinese. Stanford University for the centennial had printed up a special edition, did not mention Chinese railroad workers and had that picture again. And that university was built on the backs of Chinese railroad workers because the president of the Central Pacific was Leland Stanford. He made his fortune. So anyway, but this was a moment the Chinese Historical Society said they would get this history and put the Chinese on the map. That's what, and so Phil Choi had discussed with the organizers of the Golden Spike ceremony, and he was invited. He even had a telegram to show it, that yes, Mr. Choi, you are invited to present your plaque, which was to recognize Chinese railroad workers. And it was sponsored by the Chinese 6 companies, the Chinese community, CHSA. And so there were 2 plaques, one to be put in Sacramento, which was the beginning of the railroad, and the other would be at Promontory, the terminus. That would be the final thing. So the first plaque was dedicated, in Sacramento, and Phil Choi flew to Utah to present the second one. Meanwhile, my parents, representing the Chinese Historical Society, were taking the Golden Spike Special. It's a train. They were representing Chinese Americans. My mother was the only descendant of Chinese railroad workers in the crowd of 20,000 people, So they go there and they sit in the grandstand, and Philip Choi is ready, sitting there with his plaque, and the organizer of the president of the association producing this grand ceremony comes up to Phil Choi. His name is Mr. Goodfellow, and he says, "Oh, Mr. Choi, I'm sorry, there's no time for you." And Phil Choi just sits there, and he was just astounded. He just said he was so angry, felt like just standing up there and doing something, and but there's just no way they'd taken the microphone away from him. And then the keynote speaker, to add insult to injury, was John Volpe, the Secretary of Transportation, who gives this oration. Who but Americans could have built 10 miles of track in one day? Who but Americans could have done drilled tunnels through solid granite in the Sierras? Who but Americans? So he gives this oration. He had no reference to the Chinese because he didn't know. Nobody told him. And so that was to Phil Choi. He said it was the most devastating moment of his life. He felt he had failed. And I told him years later, you did not fail. America failed you. So this egregious act was, in the newspaper. In those days, they didn't have cell phones or internet. So San Francisco Chronicle did not publish this until 2 days later. It was called The Forgotten Men of the Golden Spike, and what happened to Phil Choi, sitting in angry silence with a few Chinese delegates, and John Volpe completely, insulting everybody and denigrating this history. So it started a movement. It started a movement that continued for 50 more years. I had, at that time, just to let you know, I thought I had succeeded, but I didn't. I was at home. The article that I wrote was called "The Unsung Heroes of the Golden Spike," was a full page feature article. It was actually my first published article. And it was about the Chinese building the railroad. So I got published, but it didn't reach national stage. So over the years, I've always worked on this. And in 2012, Professor Gordon Chang of Stanford University and Shelley Fishkin, a professor of American Studies at Stanford, they launched a new movement, and it was the Chinese Railroad Workers Project, Chinese Railroad Workers in North America Project. And they recruited me to conduct oral history of descendants. So I was there. Being a descendant, first I thought, how am I going to get stories from that far back? All I know about my great grandfather was that he lost a coin, in gold coin in one of the while he was working, and that was one story, but nothing about the railroad and how are we going to do this. But I ended up interviewing with Barry Fong, a videographer. We taped them, over 50 descendants of railroad workers, and what we found was the whole arc of Chinese America, and it was all about the exclusion law, the exclusion periods, all the discrimination, all the thing that changed how they chose professions, how they had to struggle against the glass ceiling. And it was, we went through 4 generations of stories, and that's on the website now. And then because of this activism and what Gordon had done, it reached, worldwide, a worldwide network. People heard about it all over the place, certainly in China, that there was this project. And the interest, again, AAPI month, and this was in 2014, the Department of Labor wanted to recognize Chinese railroad workers and put it in their Hall of Labor, like with the United Farm Workers. And I was asked to represent descendants and bring descendants on the stage for this presentation. And it was the first time in US history, Chinese railroad workers were recognized.
That was amazing.
So
I think that's why we call this event a Rediscover.
Yeah, so the next event would be a 5-year, 2019. So that was it took 5 years later, the final act at Promontory. It had to be symbolic. And it was just a thrilling moment for me to be asked by the organizers this time, which had Chinese Americans on the board of the 150th Golden Spike Committee, to give the opening address. And I still was paranoid at that time. Can you imagine? Because of what happened to Phil Choi. And I wore my mother's dress that she had made in 1969 for her trip, because she was going to stay several days. And it was a blue dress, Chinese cheongsam, with a jacket. And I wore the whole thing, and a piece of jade from her collection to give me strength, I guess. So, but up to that last minute, I was thinking, what if somebody comes up and said, I'm sorry, Ms. Yu, there's no time for you. I mean, there's that huge insult, had such repercussions, and it stayed with me. But I was able to, and I stood there and I saw in the crowd, there were a couple hundred Chinese Americans. They were descendants of Chinese railroad workers in the crowd of, again, 20,000. So I was able to deliver my speech without a hitch, which is surprising for me. And at the very end, I actually could say, done, and really feel it. And when I came off the stage, my brother was there and embraced me, and he had a picture of my mother and father at the first one. And somebody said, I think your ancestors were looking down on you when you gave that speech.
Yeah, I feel the blue dress needs to be preserved in a museum. I mean, it's such a historical moment, and it's just wonderful to hear the story. I kind of want to talk about it because many of the people in the audience, they are like newer immigrants, like through the years, the history of Chinese Americans in the United States include like several waves of immigration. So I myself, I came here for graduate school.
Right.
I noticed like more recent immigrants, they tend to have less interest in our ancestors' history. So, I remember when I was recommending books to them, they like, wow, it's so far away. It's irrelevant. Okay, so I just wonder why it's so important from your point of view for us to know the history. And what can we do to raise awareness of the AAPI history, especially considering this month is the AAPI Heritage Month. So what we can do to raise more awareness?
Well, see, I feel that the more recent immigrants that I've met are very, very concerned with the history because they feel they feel the anti-Asian hate. They want to know why. What is the root of this? And I just have to give you the example of Yan Zhao, and she's, was born in China, and she's now, well, let's say 2 years ago, she was mayor of, and she's still on the city council, mayor of Saratoga. And she spoke at an anti-Asian hate rally in Saratoga. And she stood up and talked about her background and the fact that, and there were signs saying, giving the history, saying exclusion law, relocation camps for Japanese Americans. These are symbols of the history of anti-Asian hate. So anyway, she spoke about how when she was running for city council, she would go to a door and a white person would open the door and say, "Oh, I don't vote for Asian Americans. I'm not voting for an Asian." And somebody came, opened the door and said, "Oh, why don't you run in Cupertino instead, where there are a lot of Chinese?" So I feel that I've been talking to so many individuals who have experienced this, and they know there's a deep history of xenophobia and anti-Asian hate, and that it does go back to the Chinese exclusion law. And they have, and I do feel that there has been an effort made by Asian American organizations with a lot of more members that are recent immigrants to tell this history and to discuss the situation, because this is a matter of life and death. I mean, so I feel that a lot it has been explored. I mean, I feel that, there are a lot of cities with support groups for, like in New York, Chinatown, support groups for Asians walking through, the elderly walking through Chinatown.
I think when I was visiting you probably 2 months ago, we would also talk about, it would be really wonderful to, actually not just wonderful, it's very important to include that part of history about Asian Americans in the school materials. I have 2 children. I really wanted them to know more about Asian American histories. I mean, I think we are making a lot of progress.
Yes.
But definitely still more we should do to fight for that.
And it is very sad that that it takes some this xenophobia, that this rise in anti-Asian hate to feel that people have to do something. And also the reason why we do talk about contributions that happen like the railroad is because this is a symbol of American enterprise. That's why people say, why do you keep talking about the railroad? Why, the Chinese did a lot of other things. I said, because this part has been excluded because it's considered so American. And the image of the Chinese doesn't fit in there. And that's, until recently. And so that's why it is so important that we keep talking about it, that the Chinese were involved in this enterprise of this, the uniting the country, East and West by rail. We were so important in that, and that's our stake in it. And the same thing with the war memorial that my father helped spearhead, that the Chinese did serve serve our country and made sacrifices fighting for the United States. So, I mean, it's terrible that we have to prove this, but that we have this evidence and we're going to use it. And that goes. And the other thing that I'm very involved in still is Angel Island. Now, this is a different aspect. And this is what people would like to hide, but now it is so part of Bay Area history, and we're trying to make it even more known. Angel Island was an immigration station that was established in 1910 with a primary purpose of screening Asian immigrants, mainly Chinese, during the exclusion law. My grandmother was detained on Angel Island from 1924 to 1925. She was the daughter of a daughter-in-law of the railroad worker. Her husband was born in the United States, but he had passed away. And when she was returning to the United States with her American-born children, they looked at her paper and said, "Oh, you're born in China. Where's your husband?" She said, "But I have re-entry permit, and I have my husband was a citizen." They said, in those days, can you imagine? A woman had no status if her husband was deceased by law. So she was detained on Angel Island, and for 15 and a half months because her teenage daughters had gone to see a lawyer who happened to be associated with a very important firm, Levi Strauss, that my grandfather had worked for. And it took 15 months of court action and 2 appeals for her to be released. So there's writing on the wall. She was detained in the barracks. There is beautiful writing on the wall if you know about it. It's poems written by Chinese immigrants.
Yes, I remember.
And they're beautifully etched in. First of all, it shows Chinese were literate, that they wrote beautiful poems, and they were poems of their anguish, their hopes and dreams. And it's the writing on the wall that saved the barracks. The barracks were supposed to be torn down. Alexander Weiss, he was a ranger on the newly assigned to the island, and by flashlight, he saw the writing on the wall. He happened to be taking a course from an Asian American professor, George Araki, who just remembered my grandmother's first steps, she said, were on Angel Island. And so they went and they photographed every inch of the barracks, and the word got out to students and to activists like myself. And we formed a committee to stop, that was later, we had to form a committee that was sanctioned by the state. And we were able to stop the demolition of the barracks. Now it has been restored. There's a huge monumental area of tribute to the immigration. And there's also a new museum that people have to see, newly opened this year. It's the all immigration to this day. And so people can to understand that it's not just one historical incident, it's a continuum of immigration policies, and we're all connected to it.
Yeah, thank you. I just felt while I was reading, researching about you and your families, I just felt it's just, you really done a lot. So many different contributions and to the business and preserving the Chinese culture, and also just how you have been kind of advocating for the Chinese community, Asian American community, for more than half a century. If you do that for a couple of years, for a decade, yes, but for more than half a century. And especially when you started, it was a hard time, it was difficult. I have so many questions I want to ask you, but I think our audience, they are very eager to ask you some questions too. And since our time is running out, so I wanted to kind of ask you some questions from the audience, okay? Here's one asking about your recommendation, because then you've done, you've had a lot of hands-on experience. I think that's why people like Connie should know how to do it. Okay, this one's Connie. I'm part of a city commission in Mountain View that's doing a project on housing discrimination in our city. Do you have any recommendations on where to look for resources about housing discrimination against Chinese and other Asian communities in this area?
Yes, well, you mentioned Mountain View. In my book, the 3rd edition of my book, we had to find a certificate of residence to put in a new one. And it's a resident of a worker. It's a certificate shown, and it says Mountain View. So there were Chinese in Mountain View, and they had to register for the Geary Act. So no community that had Chinese workers escaped, and certainly Mountain View. So I think it's important to recognize that there were Chinese workers in Mountain View, and they had to go through this process. There was and what they contributed, because all labor contributed to the building of our communities in the South Bay and Bay Area. And I think that educating people that we're not new here, that's the important thing, that people say, oh, you guys are newcomers, because, you know, we are all, whether you came early or late, we're all identified, you know, with being Chinese and identified as perpetual foreigners. So we have to establish, we've been here a long time, we have this history. The reason why there was a rush of new immigrants in the 1960s is because that was the first, you know, that was the end of exclusion. Mm. And so why did that all happen? Why did it happen so late? And why during that period, 61 years, there was so little immigration? And some people had to come in surreptitiously, you know, as paper sons and daughters. And why did that happen? So I think that there's a paper trail, there's a history that is documented, but I think it has to be connected to American history. And this struggle is part of American history. So that's why it's important to have it in the textbook, that we're not separate. You don't have to say, oh, that's your history. It is our history.
Right. Yeah, since we mentioned the, you know, textbooks and also education, actually there's a question from our audience. I mean, the question is pretty long, so I want to read the whole thing. But it's basically like, it's about how to tell the story, how to share stories to my students who are learning Chinese or of the Chinese, you know, learning Chinese, and would love to hear your advice or what we educators can do to share and spread stories, for example, about the railroads.
Oh, yes.
At school and within the community to kids and families.
I think that you had mentioned that there's documentations. There's there are documentaries on PBS. There is a lot online, and I think that it can be searched easily. You know, for instance, if you want to study San Jose, you know, Chinatowns, you go online. There's the Chinese Historical and Cultural Project, which has a whole resource list of films and books. So, and the same thing with the Chinese Historical Society of America. So there are organizations that already have gone through this process of listing books and choosing references that would be helpful to educators and to individuals, and wonderful. And I think that field trips are, I know that people, educators, teachers have been doing this, taking children, school kids, you know, up to high school, to Angel Island, to have that experience. And we're very fortunate to live here, to be able to go to places like this and to go to San Jose, Chinatown. But Angel Island is an incredible experience. I think that you'll never forget it. Seeing the writing on the wall, because what you do when you go to these places, you are a witness. You are a witness to this history. It becomes part of your sensibility.
Yeah, I think whenever I have friends visiting from out of state or from out of country, I always take them to Angel Island. Yeah, I wanted them to know that part of history. Here, actually, someone in the audience actually shared his personal story about you know, his grandma arrived on Angel Island immigration station in 1912 from Hong Kong.
Wow, that's great. It's really wonderful. I know that for a long time, a lot of Chinese immigrants did not want to say that they were on Angel Island. They said, oh, so it's a chapter. So it's a shameful chapter. And because of our committee and the work of activism and making these monuments, we say, you know, you should be proud that you survived the struggle, that you experienced this and you could tell about it. and talk about the injustice and say, you know, and speak of overcoming. So
yeah, the same person also kind of mentioned, you know, his great grandfather was a Chinese railroad worker.
oh, good. Maybe we.
Yeah, I hope someday maybe some more family history.
It's very
discovered.
important. So I have to tell you, I spoke at George Washington High School, the senior assembly last Thursday. I addressed them. I thought, how can I connect with them? And I realized they're mostly Asian, and this is AAPI month. And I spoke about it. And I said, I know that you already are activists from the banners that you have in the hallway. But I want to tell you, this is my piece of advice. Before you go to take the required ethnic studies courses, or before you take, required history, you interview your parents, your grandparents, your aunts and uncles, all your ancestors that you can find your roots from. Know your identity and also understand what they went through, their struggles, their triumphs, and how they survived. And I guarantee you, I said, this will arm you for the challenges ahead in fighting injustices and saving the planet.
Yeah, indeed. I'm totally inspired by your story. Actually, our Society of Heart Delight recently, we launched a project. It's called Photo Blog of Chinese Immigrants in Silicon Valley. So we want people to share their personal stories, coming to the United States and their experience living in the States. So, and also just sharing their interest. And we really want to build this community. We call it, my story and my community, my home. I kind of feel you need to start somewhere. Like you mentioned oral history. If all of us share our stories, all the stories actually will converge into a very powerful force. Yeah, I really felt. So some of the people in the audience also kind of mentioned that. Just really great to see those personal stories, personal photos. Then you can really draw the connection. So our time is up, and I just really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you.
So I think today it's just kind of start a conversation. And for us, we really hope, we can continue, in the future to have more opportunities to talk to you about this, about Asian American histories. And we wanted to, for me, it's still a process of educating myself. And to everyone in the audience, thank you for coming today. And I hope you have enjoyed tonight's conversation. It was a wonderful conversation. It's very rich material. I kind of felt probably many of us, after we are done with this interview, probably will just started to go to the internet, start looking for resources and information. And I also wanted to thank Connie. Connie, you are just amazing. And you have such wonderful stories and so insights. And I hope everyone will go to find Connie's books at the libraries and bookstores. I personally own several of your books, and I printed out a lot of your articles too. It was just wonderful to read. I also wanted to announce our upcoming event with the San Jose Police Department on June 6th. It will be a workshop on safety for immigrant business owners. So thank you, everyone, and stay tuned and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Connie.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Have a good night.